Hello, my name is Trina Banks, and today, along with Melissa Cherry and Sydney Basie, we will be presenting to you our project for the reproductive system. And what we will be talking about is describing the function and the components of the female reproduction system. We will start off with the first part of the presentation as I talk to you about the components of the female reproductive system. I found that the components were our ovaries, our oviducts, our uterus, our vagina, and our external genitalia. The functions of the ovaries is where we'll talk about first, and then I'll tell you what their components are, or their purpose, primary purpose. And the ovaries are actually, there are two ovaries that each woman has, and they're the size of an almond, and we have one on each side of our uterus. The purpose of those ovaries, two primary purposes that we talk about in our text today, is to produce eggs, of course, and then to produce hormones, estrogen and progesterone. The next topic, we will talk about oviducts and the functions of. Our oviducts are actually known to us as our fallopian tubes, and their two primary functions are to transport immature eggs into the uterus, and if fertilization occurs, it's usually in the oviducts where that takes place. The next one would be our uterus, the function of a uterus and the function of a vagina. The uterus is actually a hollow muscular organ that starts out as the size of a pear, and this organ is where we house the developing baby during a pregnancy, and is also where we nourish the baby receives their nourishment during a pregnancy. The functions of the vagina, which is also a muscular tube that opens on the outside of the body, is where we receive the penis for sexual intercourse, and it also serves as the birth canal, the exit passage for a baby during childbirth. The next one would be our external genitalia, and to talk about what that is so the female reproduction structures that are outside of the vagina, those are typically known as the external genitalia. And the organs include the mons pubis, labia majora, labia minora, and the clitoris. Their purpose, or the purpose of the external genitalia, is that it enables sperm to enter the body. It also protects the internal genital organs from infections, and it's also where we get our sexual pleasure. And so those were the female reproductive system and the components of. The next section, I will also talk to you today about the process of egg development. And we talked about the periods, we studied the periods of egg development. We have the pre-embryonic period, the prenatal period, and the postnatal period. The pre-embryonic period is also known as, or what we refer to as fertilization. So from fertilization through the second week is where we actually refer to the baby as the pre-embryo. The prenatal period, which is from week 3 to week 8, is what we refer to the baby as an embryo. And then the postnatal period. But before the postnatal period, we also have the fetal period, which is from week 9 to birth, where we call the baby a fetus, and then we move into the postnatal period that takes place after birth and through life of the developed human. To talk a little bit more about the prenatal period, we have 3 stages that we actually look at during the prenatal period, and it's actually a very quick process, and it starts from the time of conception to birth, and it's generally divided into 3 stages: the germinal stage, the embryonic stage, and the fetal stage, which is what we talked about on the previous slide. And so to give you a little bit more detail, the germinal stage is the 2-week period after conception. And again, it's where the sperm and the egg actually meet and they form what they call a zygote. And it takes place usually about 36 hours after conception, and it begins to divide. The zygote begins to divide really quickly. And the result is a ball of cells that moves along from the mother's fallopian tubes into the uterus. And so there's that suction again where it's pulling that zygote into the uterus. And then on the 7th day, around 7 days after conception, it starts to become embedded on the wall of the uterus. And that's again where we talk about implantation. And that takes about a week to complete. Most women probably refer to that period or notice implantation is taking place. If they're trying to conceive, they notice a little spotting after a missed cycle. The downside is if implantation fails, quite common, you'll have women that will have to terminate the pregnancy, and that's usually called an ectopic pregnancy, or a miscarriage is what we call it today. Another key feature that takes place during the germinal stage is the formation of the tissue called the placenta. And it has 2 functions, and that's to pass oxygen and nutrients from the mother's blood into the embryo or the fetus, and to remove waste materials from the baby or the embryo or the fetus. The next stage is the embryonic stage, and it lasts from the end of the germinal stage, so about 2 months, till after conception. And here's where you have the developing ball of cells now become what we call an embryo. And it starts developing all of its major organs. And at this time, it's very fragile. Doctors or nurses that work with pregnancies usually are very particular with giving instructions of making sure the baby is not exposed to any alcohol or smoking, making sure there's nothing toxic that they can receive a virus from and cause a deformity during this actual phase. So at the end of the embryonic period, the size of the fetus or the embryo is about 1 inch long. And so after we move from the embryonic stage, the baby now develops into stage 3, which is the fetal stage. And it is usually from the end of the embryonic stage until birth, so about 8 weeks into birth, I think. So about 1 month into the stage is where the baby actually begins to form and develop its sex organs. And it grows really quickly. It also starts to form its bones and its muscles. And this is typically the time where the baby starts to move inside the uterus. The organ systems develop and start to function during those last 3 months. And you'll also see where the brain of the baby increases rapidly in size. And then an insulating layer of fat forms around the skin, and the respiratory and digestive system starts to work independently for the baby. So those are the 3 functions and the phases of the embryo, the fertilization, the embryonic period, and the prenatal period. And all of those take care of are the functions that take place before the egg is developed, during the egg development, and while the egg is growing in the mother. Those are what we call the prenatal period of an egg. On the next slide, I also talk a little bit more about the pre-embryonic period to give you a little bit more in depth related to our text. A lot of the notes I have here were referred to some sites that I Googled, but I also wanted to reference our text. And it talks about fertilization, which is usually the union between the nucleus of an egg and the nucleus of the sperm, and when they come together. And what takes place in that pre-embryonic period is also the cleavage period. And that occurs the very first day after fertilization. And it occurs as the pre-embryo moves along the oviducts towards the uterus. Again, that's the suction of the uterus pulling that baby into the uterus so that it can start the next phase, implantation, and begin to develop and form. The blastocyst, it attaches to the lining of the uterus, and it differentiates into 2 different cell layers, and that takes place usually about 6 days after fertilization. Also during this period, you'll have what we call the extraembryonic membranes, which are 4 membranes that start to develop to serve their purpose. And those 4 membranes are the amnion, the yolk sacs, the elatonus, and the chorion. And they're used to protect and now nourish the embryo, which will later become the fetus. And all of that, again, still takes place during the development portion of the embryo, moving into the prenatal period of the embryo. Next, I'll talk about the birth, after birth, and the egg development. We are to talk about the number of eggs that occur during birth. And so the research that I've looked up shows that most at birth, a normal female ovary contains about 1 to 2 million eggs. And these eggs don't last a lifetime. And it's part of what we refer to as our monthly menstrual cycle, I think. Where the eggs, they're immature as they start out, but every month they go through a maturation period. And then that's where we talk about the eggs. They're stored in a follicle in the ovary, and so the lifespan of an egg will go through the maturation process, but most of them will die off. An average of 300 to 500 eggs will mature during a woman's total lifespan, and that's postnatal period. And so that's the development and the birth of a female embryo that now has to develop their own eggs and what they'll go through. And so those are the topics that I am sharing. Next, you will hear from Miss Melissa Cherry, who will share with you the ovarian cycle and hormones involved in the female reproductive system and their function. Thank you guys, and have a great week.